Hogarth's in front of Hogarth's house, Elizabeth, in December last year. And this is the part of Chyzyk that I'm hoping, not the bit at the bottom around here, but this is part of Chyzyk that I'm hoping to take you on a rather quick visit to some of the mulberry trees of. The map itself comes from the Morus Londinium project, which David Shreve of the Conservation Foundation, who I think is with us, and I and the Conservation Foundation generally put together with Heritage Lottery funding in 2016. It turned around very quickly and it's been a wonderful success, I think. We started off with 40 trees in London and now we have over 750, maybe even edging on 1,000. That's mulberry trees that just people like yourselves have written in to say and give us details of, and where I can, I follow them up. The last couple of years, I've been mostly doing it as a volunteer on my own, but we're still looking for money to keep the whole thing going. Now, I think I should just say a couple of words, because ordinarily on a real trip with real trees and real people, I'd be getting up close, we'd all be getting up close and looking at the mulberry trees. And I want to clarify something, because everyone says, oh yes, you know, mulberries came over because of silk and James I. And I want to put some of these ideas to bed before we start and to narrow down what it is that we're talking about. On this walk, we're only talking about mulberry trees that have been grown for fruit, and we're only talking about black mulberry trees, and they've always been grown for fruit. However, despite what people say, the black mulberry tree, which is a native to what used to be the Persian Empire, Iran and the Caucasus and Central Asia, was used to feed silkworms right up, well, I suppose until the 15th century in those parts of the world around the Eastern Mediterranean and Greece, especially Spain, Italy, France, all of those places that had extremely successful silk industries, were using the leaves of the black mulberry to feed the silkworms. And they were doing very well on it. The white mulberry, which is native to China and Japan, Korea, and so on, only arrived in Europe, in northern Italy, as far as we can tell, about 1432. But it's much better in a way to feed silkworms, and that's the mulberry tree that is gradually has come to be used all over the world, really, to feed silkworms. But it doesn't mean the black mulberry is no good. It just means that the leaves are more tender, they can grow more abundantly, and in places that will allow it, you can get 2 whole crops of leaves in a year. And they're easy to grow in the south, but they're not so easy to grow in the northern hemisphere, the northern part of the northern hemisphere. So they've tended not to be kept. Also, the fruit is not as nearly as nice as the fruit of the black mulberry. So when they're not being used to feed silkworms, they tend to be got rid of. So they may have been growing here in abundance, we don't know. But there certainly aren't any old trees. There's only one old mulberry tree in the whole of the UK that I know of, and that's in the Oxford Botanic Gardens, and that's about 200 years old. 99.9% of all the other mulberry trees in the UK are black mulberries, and all of the old mulberry trees, apart from the one in the Oxford Botanic Garden, are black mulberry trees. And they've been grown in the UK for their fruit ever since the Romans brought them over in the 1st century. We know that because there was a fossilized pip found in, there have been fossilized black mulberry pips found in a couple of archaeological digs dating back to the 1st century, one near the Thames, roughly where Billingsgate Market used to stand. We don't know whether that was from jams or whether they actually brought them over and grew them, but there's no evidence of them continuing to grow here after the Romans left. But medieval monasteries did plant mulberry trees for their fruit. So we know that they have been here, although not in great quantities, ever since medieval times. The big watershed moment for the mulberry tree, though, was when James I in 1608-9 wanted to start a silk industry and imported tens of thousands of mulberry trees, black mulberries as it happens, and asked the Lord Lieutenants of the shires to plant them in their estates. And so a lot of mulberry trees started coming over then, and that's really when the whole the stock of mulberry trees, and perhaps even a fashion for planting them, started. And it's never really gone away, but they're now mostly planted for ornamental purposes and for their fruit. Right, now if we were standing next to the Hogarth mulberry tree, we'd try to get up close, and there's a pretty good chance that we would see this. And this is the female flower of the black mulberry. Those little hairy things are the pollen gathering parts of the fruit. What we call a fruit, or the berry, is actually a cluster of little fruits, and every one of these things with its bunny ears is a fruit, and the whole thing is called an aggregate fruit. And technically it's called a drupe, and that's because the fleshy bit's on the outside and there's a hard stone on the inside. And all of these will turn into what we know as the mulberry, which is actually slightly unlike the blackberry, which is made up of multiple flowers. Sorry, it's one fruit that comes from a single flower, whereas this comes from a series of flowers. Each one is a separate flower. And as it happens, the fruit doesn't need to be pollinated, the flower doesn't need to be pollinated by the male flower in order to turn into a fruit. It's a weird thing of the mulberry that they will produce fruit as long as you've got some of these on the tree, whether or not they're pollinated. And this is what the male catkin looks like, and they will almost always, but not always, be on the same tree. And these little hairy bits here are what produces the pollen, and it's released under tension when the weather gets very dry. A little filament breaks and it showers out the pollen, which is then collected by the females. This slide also shows the mulberry leaf. We would be getting up close and feeling it, and you'd feel that it's quite rough and it's sort of a bit hairy underneath, and it's quite a thick leaf and it's quite tough to the touch. The white mulberry is shiny, much thinner, and is much more tender and less rough to the touch. They're characteristically heart-shaped, but these were all gathered from the same tree, so the leaf shape itself is not a very good guide to which kind of tree you're looking at. It's much more the feel of the leaf. If it's rough, it's likely to be a black mulberry tree. These, as I say, they're all come from the same tree. You can get up to 27 different leaf shapes on the same tree. They're shaped like this, especially this particular lobed form, which looks very much like some species of white mulberry, especially on the new shoots. So if you've got shoots growing up at the bottom of the tree, they're going to look like this, and on new growth, sometimes they look like this. And one of the theories is that the leaves are much smaller, and that this increases, this lobed shape on the outside increases the surface area and the area where it exchanges carbon dioxide for sugars and so on with photosynthesis. And as the leaves get larger, then that's less necessary. The bark looks like this. In winter, this is one of the few things you've got to go on. It's a sort of an orangey color, has lots of ridges in it. And it has this is quite a young trunk of an old tree as it happens. And this lumpy bit here is very typical too. You can see these on the Hogarth mulberry. And we'll come back to this later on. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Now, this is very much, as I said, a work in progress, this particular walk, but it's also, we're going to do something a little bit special, which is to travel in 4 dimensions. We're going to travel forwards and backwards and sideways, but we're also going to travel forwards and, well, not forwards so much as backwards in time. And we're going to use this tree in front of Hogarth's house as our sort of timepiece, as our travel clock. It's been standing in the same place. Well, we know since Hogarth took over the house in the 1749, 1750, but it looks as though the tree was already there, standing in the corner of an orchard, which had been there since the 17th century. So there's a pretty good chance that the tree has been in the same spot since the late 1600s. Now, these were a few that as Fanny Craddock used to say, that I made earlier. I was visiting this tree back in 2012, and you can see from the slide some of the work that's been done on the garden to take it back to one of its earlier states. This is what it looked like in 2012. I quite liked it actually, and it's all its messiness, but there are all kinds of reasons why it wasn't perhaps appropriate and didn't show the tree off in some ways to its best extent. This is a composite tree to try and get a picture to take the whole thing in. And this is a close-up I took at the time. You saw these knobbly bits. They're nothing, it's just a characteristic of the tree. And it's been propped up. Black mulberry trees tend to spread out. They have long spreading branches. And sometimes after they get very old, they actually collapse full to the ground and they put down roots and they start growing up as other trees. And I've seen that many times. And one of the things people always want to ask me is, how old is my tree? And they say, is it 1600s or something? 1600s trees, 17th century trees, tend to have already collapsed very often. They tend to be rotten on the inside, and they have done what's called as layering. They tend to put down roots and grow up new stems. And that's one of the ways that they propagate, one of the ways they reproduce. So we can see that this does have characteristics of an old tree. It tends to be sort of hollow, rotten on the inside, still extremely vigorous. And there are signs too that it's had different stems. Some of them have fallen off. This gives you an idea of the knobbly, rough bark. So here we are, we're back in 1965. And interestingly, the garden looks rather similar to the way it is going to look when it next opens. And that, as far as I understand, is deliberate. But John and Elizabeth will be able to say something about that later on. This is around the turn of the century, not the turn of the last century. And here we have 1891, and that's sort of where we're going to take a leap in time from the 1890s. And it does look here, by the way, as though there was another stem which may have got lost at some stage. Right, this is where you get superpowers and where you're able to don one of these two outfits. If you've got one of your own you want to use, you can. We're going to be taking off and going on a bit of a journey. This journey also takes us back in time into the 1860s from this Ordnance Survey map, one of the first Ordnance Survey maps. And it gives you an idea of just how surrounded, his Hogarth house is up here, just how surrounded, it's just here to be precise, it is by fields and orchards. Now, mulberry orchards are something that really have never really happened. You know, there are a few, mostly in infirmaries. So these are going to be mixed orchards, possibly with 1 or 2 mulberry trees. Anyone who has a mulberry tree, has got near one when it's in fruit, knows that you don't need many trees to have more mulberries than you can possibly deal with, unless, like Tiptree in Essex, you're actually making jam out of them and selling them. Right, we're off. We're taking off and we're going north over Chyzyk. Turnham Green, which technically, as far as I understand, is still part of Chyzyk. We're going into this U-shaped building here. And we're going to land on the ground. And the building is called St. Catherine's Court. And I was introduced to this by somebody, a resident at Stamford Brook called Peter Royal, who took me to see a tree that we're going to see a bit later. And he said, oh, there's another one I'd like you to see. And he took me around here from Turnham Green Station, around the corner of this rather unprepossessing 1930s block of flats, through this archway, and to this mulberry tree. Now, this mulberry tree, if anyone knows anything about mulberry trees, knows it's a lot older than the building around it. Now, one of the great things about the Morus Londinium project, and one of the reasons I was very interested in it, is not only to identify these amazing trees, but they are, I call them, well, lost angels of a ruined paradise. It's a line that comes from a poem by Shelley. And the lost angels of a ruined paradise, paradise being a garden, and they are in places where they don't belong, but they do belong to a ruined paradise which is no longer there, or a paradise which has been ruined. In other words, while their trunks and leaves and all the rest of the visible parts are still above ground, their roots are in gardens which have long disappeared. And my great intrigue, and what the Morus Londinium project is now becoming, as well as a record of all the mulberry trees, young and old, not only in the Greater London area, but in fact, increasingly all over the country, is these lost gardens. When I see a tree that's old like this, and it's somewhere where it's quite clearly older than the surroundings, I think, why is it there? What's it doing there? And I go to the library and I go to the archives and I start to look and to see what may have been there before. Inevitably, I find an old house or a manor house or some place that had substantial grounds and somebody living there who was quite well off. we get into this tree, we can see that it has collapsed, and we can see these new stems coming up. And there's a good chance, if it's looked after, that this will look like a grove of trees at some stage in the future. And some of the really old trees that I know of, like those in a private part of Syon House, which is not very far from Chyzyk, of course, are just like that. They look like little groves of trees, whereas in fact it's just one tree where the central core has disappeared altogether. I use infrared photography sometimes. Not only is it spectacular, but it allows me to see the structure of the tree sometimes, where the leaves tend to conceal it. Now, when we look back in time to see why this tree is here, we can go back to the 1860s. Before the local development, which is a very famous area called Bedford Park, was built. And in the 1860s, this particular site looked like this. And you can see the similarities. There's a row of hedges growing up on the right, and then you've got this row of houses and a street growing up there on the left. And so we're talking about a very similar area. And the tower house here corresponds to about this area here of what was there in the 1860s. Which was a place called Sydney House, and it was surrounded by orchards and fields and so on. Now you have Tower House here. When Bedford Park was created by Jonathan Carr, one of the main architects was somebody called Norman Shaw. And Norman Shaw designed this house called Tower House. And a very splendid house it was. Right, and it looked something like this. And it continued in this shape until the 1930s, when it was demolished and actually turned into the St. Catherine's Court buildings that the tree now stands in the inner courtyard of today. So this is a very grand house. It's probably the biggest and best in some ways of Bedford Park at the time. And interestingly, near where I live, up in Hampstead, was Norman Shaw's own residence, and he built this house for himself, which is still there, and you can see the resemblance really. So just give you an idea. And this red brick is very characteristic of some of the houses that he built for Bedford Park. Now, up here you can see, it's called just St. Catherine's here. Some of these buildings here, the club, I think, building is still there. It became a convent and a school for a little while. And in fact, it carried on like that until, I think, from 1908 or something to 1933, roughly. And this is what it looked like when it was a school. Right, so here we are again. This is what it looks like now. Another last look at the tree. As I was talking to the local residents, they pointed out other trees, and there's another mulberry tree on the lawn across the other side of the path. The one we looked at before is over here to the left. Anyone who knows more about this, then please chip in, because somebody knows the value of mulberry trees, has been planting them. Right, we've got to put your flying gear on again, and we're going to take off southwest towards the Thames now. You're going in spurts because of the jet propulsion that we have, and we're going to land in this area here. And this is St. Peter's Square Gardens, which is sort of an 1820s square. I can't pretend to know huge amounts about it, but I know that it was built around the 1820s, and there are a few celebrities who've lived here. Now this is the Mulberry Tree, which is in the corner, the left-hand corner as you go through that gate, of St. Peter's Square Gardens. It's not a very old tree. It probably doesn't date back to the 1820s. I think it's probably more like 1960s or 70s or something. Anyway, it's a very typical tree. You can see the characteristic shape of the black mulberries, and having seen some of these now in the images I've shown, perhaps if you don't know what a mulberry looks like, you will be able to identify one, I hope, anyway. But it is leaning over, this tree, beginning to anyway. And that's very characteristic of black mulberry trees. Right, our car is still there. We're not going to use it for the rest of the journey. And we're going to walk around the edge of St. Peter's Square. Now, what I've been able to find out is there are a few celebrities who live down here. Trevor Nunn, the theatre director. He lived at number 20. No, I'm not sure where he lived, actually. John Piper, the painter, lived at number 22. Alec Guinness at number 5. Vanessa Redgrave, I'm not quite sure where she lived, and Island Records, which was a great favourite of mine, who was, I believe, started by the bass player from the Animals. No, Chaz Chandler, I think, from the Animals, unless I'm wrong about that. They had their base here as well, Island Records. So we're walking down here. Wherever we can walk, we're going to walk past this little row of cottages. But as is characteristic of this whole area, we soon come, sadly, it's one of the most beautiful parts of London, I think, parts of it. We come across this road, which is necessary, I suppose, in some senses, but it's also a blight. And we're going to fly over that. We don't want to go either under the underpass or to wait for a green light to cross it. And we're going to land on the other side and go down left here, down British Grove to the end. Gives you a bit of a flavour of where we might have walked had we been able to. Now, one of the things about this and why we're having to do some flying is that I'm using Google Earth, and Google Earth's little smart cars can't get down these little roads. So we then have to fly up in the air and have a look right through to the end. We can land again, but then we've got to fly again. And this time where we land is in Mulberry Place. And Mulberry Place is the other end of this red arrow where we've flown to. And as you can see, you've got the Thames over to the right, in other words, the south. And I'll go back there again. You've got Chyzyk going behind us to the right. Now, Mulberry Place has Mulberry in the name, and I have sent out all kinds of calls and requests to find out why it's called Mulberry Place. I don't know, but one of the extraordinary things that I'm finding out, and I haven't got anywhere near even a quarter of the way through my research, is to find out just why there are so many mulberries in this little part of London. In other words, between the Thames really and, well, possibly Chiswick High Street, I suppose. So we're now going to walk down Chiswick Mall, which I'd heard of, and somebody had written into the Morus Londinium site saying that her gran used to live at College House on Chiswick Mall. And she said, when I was growing up, there were lots of old mulberry trees there. I don't know if they're still there. So there was a clue there, and I vowed 2, 3, 4 years into the project to go there and find out for myself. And the old Chyzyk Protection Society helped me by sending out emails and letters to the residents. And I was invited to see some of the trees. And I was going out there, I think I went on the 11th of March. And as everybody knows, only a few days later, the whole lockdown thing happened and I wasn't able to go back. One of the people who did get in touch with me was Stephanie Camus, who lives at Cedar House. And she kindly invited me in with her husband, Philip, to look at their mulberry tree, which you can see from the road. There's a gate up here. And I'm trying to show you the ones that you can see from the road. I was invited into other houses down here, and I've seen trees that I will show you later on, but I'm not going to say where they are. It was a discretion really on their part to invite me in. And I don't want to advertise where they are until they're okay with that happening. So we'll see the trees, but I won't tell you exactly where they are. Some of you may know. That mystery may or may not be revealed, but I think Stefan is okay with me sharing this one. And anyway, you can see it from the street. Here is the tree. And because I was with the owner, I was allowed in. Now, I think this is a lovely tree, and it's a lovely tree with a beautiful view. There probably isn't another mulberry tree along well, anywhere in London that has this kind of view. It's not astonishingly old. Stephanie has also been doing her research, and she's found that there was a building here about 100 years ago. And so it will be 100 years or 90 something years. And that is recent in relation to some of the trees in the area, which are more like 300 years old. But it's still a fine tree, and it's one that's got lots of scope to grow and continue to thrive. It's being propped up, which it will need to be, and it's being looked after. I think it's great. It's in fine condition. So we're going to go back onto Chiswick Mall, and we're going to walk down the street. Some of these houses down here are quite notable. Many of them were, most of them in fact, were built in the 1700s, around 1730, and lived in by various dignitaries, politicians, and people with plenty of money and influence. And it still is one of the most beautiful parts of London, and is very prized by people who have made their fortunes one way or another, or inherited the buildings and so on. Now, this looks like I've been trying to break in somewhere, but on my early walk, I'd heard about College House, and I just wondered, I couldn't go into any of these houses. I had no invitations to go in. So I was just looking out for trees from the street that looked as though they might be mulberry trees. It's quite hard, actually, in the winter. Sometimes they can look like catalpa trees, you know, the bean trees. And I'm never totally confident, especially if they're a way off, but it looks like there's one at the back here. And I'm sure people who are joining on the walk may know of other trees and can say something later if they want to, or just get in touch with me through the Morus Londinium project. One of the most famous houses down here is Walpole House, which again is a 17th century house. Sorry, an 18th century house, beg your pardon, 1730s. And we do know, and from various sources, that there is an open garden days and so on, that there is a mulberry tree at the back. This was a picture that was sent to me via the Old Chyzyk Protection Society, and wondering if this tree here is the black mulberry. Picture taken in the 1860s. Now, from what I've seen, there are some stone steps up to a flagged area, and on the left of that flagged area is the mulberry tree. It's an L-shaped garden. It's very big. We can see it from the air a bit later on. There may be questions. Walpole is much older than the 17th century. Timber framing inside. Okay, so it's probably 1700s, but in 1600s could be, I suppose. I'm hoping that somebody can clarify this later on. So it has timber framing inside. Some of these houses have obviously been added to and changed over the years. Now, this is what I'm saying. I don't know a lot about the houses down here. I do know quite a bit about mulberry trees, so I'm hoping you can all help me. So we're walking down, we're going in fits and starts. We're coming up to Fuller's Brewery, which, as far as I can tell, was actually on the site of a brewery that was opened in the 17th century. And we're going up in the air again because we want to land around here, just round the corner from the brewery, in front of Mulberry Cottage. Now, I have nothing to add except that it's an intriguing title and makes me want to go in and to look round the back. So if Mulberry Cottage owner wants to let me in, if they've got a mulberry, then please get in touch, and then we can add another little bit to the story. So we're going back onto the mall again, past Fuller's Brewery. Now, whenever I go down here, the smell of hops just takes me in, and I have to go and have a half or a pint at the Mawson's Arms, I think it is, just up the road. I've got a thing from Valbot that says the tree was bombed in 1940 and then rescued. Is that it? From Kew? Okay. Bedford House and Garden belonged to John Lindley in the 19th century. Okay, right. So there's quite a lot to be said about these trees. Then if you can see the chat, you can see these coming up as they come up. And thank you so much for keep us informed. We can have some of these extra things coming in at the end. I've got to get back onto the notes. Right, so this is what the mole looked like in 1822. And that's, well, quite a bit into the history of some of these trees already. But it's rather different to the way it looks now, although the curve, the Thames and the houses themselves won't have changed a huge amount. And you can see St. Nicholas Church at the end. Now, this is in one of the gardens of one of the houses on Chiswick Mall. I'm not going to say until I'm allowed to say who it belongs to. And when I was invited in, having been told that there were some old trees in the back gardens, my jaw dropped. There are very few trees in London area that are as old as these trees. There's one next door as well, which is of a similar age. They're about 3 meters around the trunk. And if you can talk to anybody, even the most skeptic arboriculturalists, and they will say most of the trees, the old mulberry trees we see, are like a Victorian, they're 100, 150 years old. I would agree with that. And that to be much older than that, they would have to be probably beginning to rot, and they would be something like 2.5 to 3 meters around. And these are, it's like something like 90 centimeters, I think, in circumference, in diameter, something like that. These trees are that old, and there's almost no doubt in my mind that they're as old as the houses. So they're 1730s or something, which makes them among the oldest mulberry trees in London. Some of them go back to the 1600s, and possibly some of these are that old as well. But you can't really tell. You can't count rings on a tree. You can only look at things like the circumference. Huge spreading branches going out both ways, propped up. And next door is in the next house, and there was one house joined together with a common garden. There's another old mulberry tree, the same age, and that one is 3 meters around. And for the 2 trees to be planted there, you might think this is part of an orchard. I still don't know. The mystery is there. That's where I want to go next in terms of my research. I measured this tree myself, and I know it's 3 meters around. It's an astonishing tree, and it's astonishingly good condition as well. These branches going up and then falling to the ground, they will touch the ground, and they will undoubtedly start to produce new trunks that will grow up. And when this main stem eventually goes, there's a very good chance that tree with the same genes, the same genetic structure, one or more will continue to live. So this is what, if you think you've got a 300-year-old tree, or you might wonder, this is what you should be looking for, or one that's even in a more dilapidated state than this one is. Some of these old trees have been pollarded. In other words, the branches have been cut back. There are trees in Hatfield House that I know were planted, or at least purchased, by John Tredescant in 1611. I've seen his bills for them. And they are pollarded. In other words, they don't have these spreading branches. They're very squat trees. They're a bit fatter around. And they don't have this structure. Now, all the old trees in Britain, or nearly all of them, are pollards. It helps them to live a lot longer. This is not a pollarded tree. So we're back on the Mall again. This, I believe, used to be the Red Lion pub. Somebody from the local area will tell me. But ceased being a pub some time ago. I think, I can't remember why. Now we're going past houses which have a history, and that's because I don't know the history. This is Chyzyk House and Lingard House. Sorry, here with a circular frontage to it. I don't know if there are mulberries in the background. Yes, the Red Lion. It's the Red Lion, not a posh house. Thank you very much, Valbot, who I know is an expert in this whole area. So thank you for being with us and for chipping in with these little tidbits. Now a posh house. Okay, the Red Lion is now a posh house. We can go back and see it. Here we are. It's now a posh house, not a pub. I bet people walking down here wish it was still a pub, actually. Still, you've got the Mawson's Arms around the corner, so not far to go. Chyzyk House, which has been variously described for its aesthetics in positive or negative terms. This, I'm not sure. Somebody can tell me which one. Is that Woodruff House? I'm not sure. And now we're going to the corner here where we have St. Nicholas Church in view. And what I'm going to do now is take you up in the air again, just so we can have a look at what the gardens look like from above without singling out any particular ones because of their mulberries. This is Walpole House, and you can see the L-shaped garden structure at the end, which I'm now told is older than 17th century. And the mulberry tree would be down here, according to the photograph. But I've not been there on open garden days, if it is open, and not been invited in, so I don't know exactly where it is, but very intrigued to. And I know there are others down here because the residents have been in touch with me, and there are also some up Chiswick Lane. But what you can see about this is that it's never, apart from these houses, all post-war. There's no development behind. So, hang on. And if you go back to maps of the 1860s, you can see that really, in terms of what there is now and what there was then, you've got a lot more open space here than there is now. But behind the row of houses here along Chiswick Mall, there wasn't anything. There isn't anything, and there wasn't anything. There is up here, of course. But you had the Royal Horticultural Society gardens that were up in Turnham Green, much further up. These were planted as orchards and fields. But there's no hidden story. They are where they were. The trees were planted in the gardens in which they now thrive. So that's sort of an end of a mystery. Now what I'm interested in is some of the older trees. So we're just going to walk past Hogarth's tomb, which we can come back to quite shortly. And now we're going to fly off towards Chiswick House. And when I started this, just to show my ignorance, last year in December, I didn't even know, although I thought there would be a tree inside the grounds of Chiswick House. I hadn't been there. And luckily, Clooney Wells, who's the archivist at Chiswick House, got in touch and said, yes, come and have a look at it, and took me to see it. And it is in the grounds of, well, it's in the kitchen garden. I'm not going to go into the details here. We can go into this a bit later on. The history of Chyzyk House is slightly complicated by the fact that it merged with the Moreton Hall, which is an older house next door, to which this garden belonged, the 6th of Devonshire, I believe, bought it in 1812. What we do know is that the tree that's in the kitchen garden that belonged to Moreton Hall, that was transferred in the deeds, did include 2 mulberry trees at the time in 1812, and this is one of them, still standing where it's always stood in the kitchen garden by the rear wall. Again, this is 2.5 meters around, I seem to remember, something like that. So it's an old tree. It's going to be older than 1812, and it probably goes back to the 1700s also, because it was already noted in the deeds of transfer in 1812. So it's got to be 50 to 100 years older than that. So it's maybe 1730. It's an infrared picture. It's not snowing or anything, showing that it's slightly rotten on the inside. Another view showing the other way. And now we're going to fly on a little bit. I want to leave a little bit of time at the end. The other mulberry tree is at the end of the arrow here, but it's not within the grounds. So we're now going to walk up Duke Avenue. So we come out from here, turn left. We're going to walk up, I think it's Duke's Avenue. Now the mulberry tree, the other one, is now in the garden of one of these houses, and I've not yet had access to it. So we're walking onto this lovely street at the end. After the peace and quiet of lockdown, I imagine this road still looks almost as busy as it does in this picture. Going to walk along here quite quickly across this road, looking left and right. And now along the wall of Hogarth House to the exit. And this, now I think this comparison, you can see here the entrance to Hogarth House. The mulberry tree is just the other side of this wall. And this is what it looked like 100 and something years ago. And oh, that it should look like that still today. So we're going to go in. And now I'm going to, in a minute, hand over to John Collins, if he's able to join us. Going back in time, there are old engravings and so on that show the tree. This is a wood block, 1874 tree, and it looks as though this bit fell off actually at some stage. We can see from Hogarth Lane, which you've seen a picture of just now, how the whole area was surrounded by orchards and fields. And this is a picture, I think, that Hogarth, a drawing he made, showing the fields and so on around in Chyzyk at the time. It looked very different to the way it does now. and John Rock's map of 1746, which is really the time that Hogarth moved in, only a few years later. So it won't have been substantially different to this at the time. Just a quick connection, because the connection between mulberries and silk is not always the one that needs to be emphasized, especially in trees, the black mulberries that were grown for their fruit and still are. But Hogarth, of course, did this series of etchings called Industry and Idleness. And it was set in Spitalfields, and this is one of the upstairs looms in Spitalfields, where, of course, they were weaving silk that Spitalfields became famous for. We don't really know if any mulberry trees were grown in Spitalfields, but I thought there was a nice little connection there. There are other connections too between the Comptons, who had something to do with Chiswick House, and Canonbury, where there's a place, Canonbury House, that was belonged to the Comptons at one time, and that has a very old mulberry in it. Right. So I think we're now into John's preserve. We can open this up to any comments as well. I don't know if, Andrew, if we can put John on a speaker or something.
I'll see if anyone can hear me as I speak.
Oh, yes, I can. Hello, John.
Okay, hi there.
You're going to have to say next slide then, please, yeah?
Okay. Okay, so thank you so much, Faith. That was absolutely fascinating and really interesting, and a lot of trees that I had absolutely no idea existed, which, considering that the mulberry tree at Hogarth's house is very much the centrepiece of our garden, and is what we have named our whole project to renew it after, I will need to follow you on your journey of discovering more about the local mulberries in the area as well. But yeah, I just wanted to give a little bit of context about the house itself, really. So just a bit of a whistle-stop history about the house, and also a little bit about some of our plans to what we're going to have, because we are nearing the very end of a project to completely re-landscape and replant our garden, and the mulberry tree is our centerpiece for that. So yeah, so just to go back, there's a few crossovers from things Peter's already covered here. Just to emphasize the Roke map there, you can see that the common field area, which is sort of the center of the image at the top, Hogarth's house was very much the last house in the town of Chyzyk and overlooks the common field. And if we go to the next slide.
I'm sorry.
Yep, this is the view that we've got this etching from the 1780s that's after a sketch that Hogarth did of the 1750s, and that's looking across the common field at his house. So you see the house to the left there, the wall which still exists. So you have a view of very different from the 6 lanes of busy traffic which sit outside the house now. And if we go to the next slide. Hogarth wasn't the first resident. The house that was built was, as Peter mentioned about orchard, a mixed orchard that was enclosed from that common field we just saw in the 1680s by the Downes family. And by 1713, it had been inherited by their son, who built a house in the corner. And the first owner was this man, who was a Lutheran minister in Savoy, and this was his second house. This is Ruperti, Pastor Ruperti, and he was the first person to own it. And if we go to the next slide, Hogarth, as we see here in his own self-portrait with his pug, bought the house in 1749. And we'll see from the next slide that he made some changes. So the house he bought, you can see the mulberry tree branches in the foreground just poking out there. There would have been quite a few different types of planting in the garden. I'll come to that as I speak here, but just to point that Hogarth makes some changes. He's got a studio, which now has disappeared, but he would paint, he would do his work and produce his art and his prints in the garden above his coach house. From the next slide. He lived with his wife And Jane, after Hogarth dies in 1764, she inherits the house, and it stays in the family until the early part of the next century. If we see the next slide. And then the house goes and has a few other occupants through the 19th century. Henry Francis Carey on the left there was a poet and curate of St Nicholas's Church, which we just saw. But after his death in the 1740s, the family that buys the house moves to Australia by choice, and they are then renting the house out. And the chap you see on the right there is Newton Treen Hicks, who was an actor of some renown who lives there. But by the next slide, the house had gone into multiple occupation. So this shows there were a couple of families in the house. There were pigs being kept in the garden, a business being run from the ground floor. There was a nurseryman working the grounds. So the house and its garden were very much, they were subject to what was happening in the area. So just the picture we saw earlier that Peter finished with was from the 1890s, the lovely small alley, but actually that was indicative of quite a big change in the area and the character of the area changing from out of town to much more industrialized. And there are these cottage industries going on at the house as well. If we look at the next slide, you can see that there are houses over the wall to the left of us. You see the mulberry tree looking very fine and proud there in the left of the image. And if we go to the next slide, that's the image that Peter was talking about. And the next slide on, that's the house gets bought in the 1890s and is Hogarth's nursery garden for 10 years or so. That's an image from there. But I was actually thinking the next slide on, in fact. The house gets sold, and in 1901, it's bought by a local man, Lieutenant Colonel Shipway. And by 1904, it's open as a museum to the public. There's a collection of Hogarth prints, and the house and garden is open, but with custodians living inside. And that's an arrangement that would continue all the way through the 20th century. So the site's been open to the public since 1904. And although not quite continuously with interruptions like COVID and some wars, it has been a museum. And if we see the next slide, you can see the garden there. And this is, I think, 1913, I want to say. And you can see the mulberry tree to the right at the back there. We've restored, as part of the project that we're doing now, the original line of the path that we're looking at here. So that breeding gravel path is back with the beds to the left of that. And our planting will, rather than taking back the garden to a particular point in its history, it's now going to reflect everything that the garden's ever been through its life. So we have a number of beds laid out on the left there that are going to go show different types of planting. We have different fruit trees to reflect the history, and quite a few different styles of planting to reflect those various bits of history. Things haven't always been quite so smooth from the house, though, and particularly the tree. And if we see the next slide, the crooked nature of the tree as is now, it was absolutely fascinating to hear what Peter was saying about the way mulberries sort of collapse and continue themselves. This was slightly enforced on the tree at Hogarth's house because in 1940 there was bomb damage that did this to the front of the house and also damaged the mulberry tree, which is something I think Val was chipping in on the chat about as well. And the propping that we have on the mulberry tree to this day was done by people from Kew who came out in the effort to sort of rescue the tree after that point. If we go to the next slide. And just to say, this is the house as is now. We did a refurbishment in 2011. And if we see the next slide, 2011 was our focus inside. And since this project has been working on outside. So the house on the left at the back there, and we've built a new learning studio, which you can see the center and the right of the image. It's a slightly dark photo from the fact that it was taken in winter when things had just happened. Much of the planting doesn't actually show, and I was actually there today The lawn is a wonderful mixed planting lawn that's full of flowers and various different types of other plant and clover, and is currently, thanks to lockdown, about as high as my knee. On the left, you see some of the beds that I mentioned there. The tree is very much going to be the centre of a lot of our activity. We're going to do plenty of stuff. We've been putting plenty of stuff out on social media. So if anyone wants to follow the house on either Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, we have an account. They're very new, so any followers welcome. And all our activity at the moment is on there because unfortunately COVID means that we're shut. But we do hope that we can open again this year. Yeah, we'll have an exciting and blooming garden. And my final point to add actually about the garden, just conscious of time, is to the right you see the arbor constructions, which are blacksmith made, and our new nut walk, and growing up against each of them are hazels as well. So there'll be a hazelnut walk to the right. Yeah, so our actually, Elizabeth, who is our learning and engagement officer, has just found a very exciting opportunity. I'll finish on the Mulberry Tree, of something we might pursue doing with our fruit, is we think we found the possibility that we could make ink with the fruit.
Oh.
So we're currently exploring how we might make ink from the fruit, which is a very nice link considering Hogarth and his prints and the printmaking aspect of the house as well. So we might be able to really marry up the house and the garden in an interesting way. So stay tuned for updates.
Thank you very much, John. Perfect timing. I'm just, thank you for rounding off exactly as we hope we would be able to. I'd just like to end just by drawing your attention, for those of you who don't know it, the Morus Londinium website, which, as I say, the Conservation Foundation started with a bit of help from me back in 2016 with Heritage Lottery funding, which ran out a couple of years ago, and we've been just continuing it on a voluntary basis ever since. We started with something like 40 mulberry trees plotted in London from existing databases and word of mouth, and we now have 750 plus, perhaps edging up to 1,000. And if you go on it, you can click on any of these where it says 28. That means in that area there are 28 trees, and so on. And you can use that to find out about local history, but you can also use it for foraging, as long as these trees are publicly accessible, and many people do that. Now then, I've got some other things. So I just wanted to thank you, and for all of those who can help to contribute. This is very much an ongoing process. I have a, I can't see all of my chat screen here. I'm going to see if I can maybe stop the sharing, Andrew. I'm not sure. Is that a good idea? I can't see the chats. I've only got, I moved it out of the way and I can't move it back again at the moment. So I might just stop the share at the moment. Now I can see the whole thing again. There's been loads of things coming up for the chat. If anyone wants any questions, something about gin, seeing Sip Smiths around the corner. Andrew's always on about his gin. Very interesting. Right. Okay. 1914. I can see all your lovely contributions. I hope we can keep a record of those anyway. If anyone has anything urgent they want to ask, the chat's been going on, and I think they were being shared with everybody. Does anyone need to say anything else? If not, I would just like...
Yeah. John, there was one question about when will the builders finish? I think June Ford Crush asked when might the builders finish? Are you close to finishing with the builders?
All of our builders and a lot of our staff are actually on furlough at the moment. So everybody's just starting to mobilise again. And we're obviously, the biggest thing with COVID actually isn't getting people to work back, it's getting the supply chain to work again. So I don't know at this point is the very honest answer. I'm hoping that we will be fine by the autumn, but that really is a guess at this stage. Things will become much clearer as everybody seems to be getting back to work. But unfortunately, this project has been dogged with a variety of changing start dates, which is as nice a phrase as I can think to put it at this point. But yeah, the ambition is certainly that we are open the house as soon as possible, but the garden by September is the ambition. We'll have to keep updating. So our new website will be out soon, and our social media will have updates as well. So keep an eye out for those.
Okay, it's really brilliant. And as I say, this is a work in progress, not only for Hogarth's house, because the best is yet to come, where we can all come in and have a look and join in and everything. And hopefully I can be there too, to do something physically around and near to the tree in the future. Andrew, I think we'd also like to draw anyone's attention, if you've enjoyed this, to the rest of the Urban Tree Festival program. I'll be joining in a webinar on Saturday with Neil Sinden of the Campaign for the Rural England, and also the Urban Orchard Project, and an artist who's made pinhole cameras out of apples to talk about the urban orchard in a webinar. There's a comment here. Yep.
No, I've said I've posted up the links there in the chat.
Fantastic.
So if anyone would like to scroll through the chat, you can find the links to the festival program and things. But I'm afraid we're kind of out of time, so
Yep.
I have to sort of pull it to a close. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Peter Coles, and especially to Elizabeth, although she's down here as Beth and John from the London Borough of Hounslow at Hogarth House. And thank you to all of you for coming along and joining in. And we do hope you'll come and join in on other events during the festival. We're at the midway point, so it's not over yet. We'd love you to join us for other events, and look out on the urbantreefestival.org website. And thanks again, Peter.
Thank you very much for everyone for showing up and being patient with any of the frustrating parts. I don't think there were too many this time, actually, but lovely. Thank you very much. And sorry for anything we missed out. And next time we do it, there'll be even more information. Thanks a lot, and have a lovely week, and join in any of the other Urban Tree Festival things that might interest you.
Thank you and goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.